All right, so this grinder, and particularly the burr that's inside here, Kinu's Pour Over Burr, really strange. Also really cool. There's a lot to unpack here. This is a coffee hand grinder. It's called the Kinu Rebel. And before we get into any of the weirdness going on with the Pour Over Burr inside, I want to talk very briefly about Kinu models. First off, they all look like exactly the same, so it's kind of hard to tell them apart at first. All of them use the same burrs, a lot of the same internals and design principles, and you can just kind of pick your trim level almost depending on what you're looking for. The Rebel comes in at about $50 less than the flagship, the Classic, with a couple little changes. Most of the internals are the same actually. This funnel up here is ABS instead of metal, and it also has this ridge design on the body that Kinu first did with the Titan, all titanium limited edition model. It's also got the same catch cup, magnetic, as the Classic, and it is very heavy, but a little bit lighter than the Classic, just under 1 kilo. Now, all Kinu grinders have a very premium feel. The fit and finish is just top tier. It really feels like it's been precision manufactured. Everything is tight, no play, very fluid, very high-end feeling. A couple Kinu grinders were sent to me by the fine team at Cafune. Now, neither Cafune nor Kinu has any input into these reviews, and they're seeing them at the same time as you. Pretty cool story with Kinu, actually. They've been around for a long time, and manufacturing standards and sustainability-wise, because they manufacture these grinders in Romania, they're subject to all of the labor standards and so on that come along with being part of the EU. Material sourcing-wise, they get a lot of their steel from a Swiss manufacturer that pulls from Swiss and German sources, and anything that they can't source, more or less locally, like bearings or whatever, they only collaborate with suppliers who comply with EU standards on sustainability and ethical labor practices. The burrs inside here are produced in collaboration with Italmill, an Italian manufacturer. And the magic for this one that we're going to look at today is hiding in here. Now, to take this grinder apart, you just unscrew this thumb screw at the top, after which the handle slides out and this little locking nut pops out. Then you can hold the burr and unscrew the adjustment mechanism all the way, after which the axle slides out. And inside, we can see Kinu's gold pour over burr. Now, this is a 47 millimeter burr. The internal part of the burr is actually narrower. It's the outside burr that's 47 mil, and they take a pretty interesting approach with this thing. It's slightly different geometry than the stock burr, and you can get it as an add-on, but only the inner burr. It works with the stock burr, outer burr, kind of the collar that goes around on the outside. And the quality of the cups between those two burrs are very different, and we're going to talk about how. But first, let's put this back together, basically do everything the reverse, and then make some coffee. Once you have it all together, you adjust the grind size by, again, loosening this thumb screw up here and then rotating the adjustment screw down here. And with like any other hand grinder, more or less, you take your beans, you put them in the top, and then you start grinding. Kinus have this bit of a unique thumb stopper here. I can kind of sometimes put it under my finger or use it as a thumb stopper. I kind of flip-flop on that. Once you're done grinding, you're ready to make your coffee, and that's where things are going to get pretty interesting. So you go online and you start looking up how to brew with this, see people's experience with it, and you will see a lot of disagreement on how it's best used and what it's good at. You'll see some people saying it's amazing, some people saying it's kind of flat, I wasn't really into it, and then you'll see other people saying, I just can't seem to figure this thing out. And that's because this burr doesn't really behave or feedback like other burrs. So let me share my experience with it. And to kind of frame this conversation, I'm going to introduce a couple other grinders. This one over here is made by a company called Espresso, and it's called a ZP6. And this one over here is called a Comandante C40. And these two grinders really are on almost opposite spectrums of the cup profile world. The ZP6 is very clear, a lot of flavor separation, not a lot of body, very tea-like cups. And the Comandante C40 will provide a much more integrated, sweet, blended, and some would say flattering cup. Now, normally when you dial in a coffee grinder, the taste profile of that grinder kind of just is what it is. Doesn't change too much, gives a very kind of particular flavor profile style of cup. And both of these grinders would fall into that category. They kind of have their sweet spot and they brew a certain way. The Kinu Pour Over Burr is not really like that. It's a little bit more of a chameleon. You know, when you're looking around online about this stuff, you'll see people comparing the Kinu Pour Over Burr to the ZP6 quite a lot, actually, saying it's great at high clarity, closing in on that Pietro and ZP6 grinder territory that seems to be pretty elusive. But it also has a little bit of elevated sweetness and mouthfeel. It will pull those flavors together just a little bit more in my experience and present the acidity in a pretty unique way too. When you set up for that style of brew with a Kinu, the grind is crazy coarse, a lot coarser than you would expect. But you can actually tweak things to be pretty drastically different, actually. You can go a lot finer on your grind and actually shift the profile, at least in my experience, from something closer to here down to something over here, a little bit closer to a C40, a little bit more intensity, a little bit more blended, and a little sweeter. And I think that flex is actually where a lot of the confusion and struggling to figure out the pour over burr actually comes from, is because it can kind of do several things. Now, I will share my tips on how to dial in kind of each end of the spectrum. But first, let's taste this coffee. And that is a very striking cup of coffee. This is roasted by September Coffee. This is a Colombian thermal shock, actually, from Diego Bermudez's farm, and it's actually named after his daughter, Letty. Very strong peach, some tea overtones, actually. Delicious, delicious cup of coffee. Bit of a unique presentation to the acidity too. Like, it's not like overbearing in your face. It's kind of nicely packaged in there. Now, before we get to dialing in what you might be looking for in a cup, let's talk about what's actually going on here. And the short and unsatisfying answer is we don't really know. Burr design really at this point is in some ways even more art than it is science. And even up to recently, there was a big school of thought that kind of thought, you know, high uniformity in your grind size is the gateway to incredible pour over. And you can get really incredible pour over that way. But then there are burrs like this that come along and they have a very wide particle uniformity spectrum. You know, you have a lot of these little tiny particles called fines, and then some really big particles called boulders. And in other grinders where that would produce a really unfavorable cup of pour over, for some reason, in this grinder, it really just seems to work. And not only that, it can give you a very high clarity cup, which normally you would not see fines and high clarity in the same picture, but also you can shift the cups to a much more blended and intense cup. And over time, it's kind of come to the surface that this whole particle size uniformity thing is a lot more complex than anybody realized. You know, it's not just uniformity, it's also particle shape that impacts how a brew will go. And the way that all those factors come together in this grinder just happen to be very unusual. Now, I don't think anybody actually set out to create that. I think they just probably were testing different burr designs and they came across one that they seemed to work, and oh, it also does this kind of really interesting stuff. Now, I think that's also led to a lot of confusion about the best way to brew with this, and I think the kind of funny answer to it is it's almost like everybody is kind of right, but let me help you a little bit with this to get your best cup using the Kinu Pour Over Burr. So if you want this style of cup, very clear, a lot of flavor separation, you really want to be able to pick out those flavors in your coffee, almost like you're looking at a dinner plate. If that's the style of cup you're looking for, you want to grind actually quite coarse. You know, every Kinu, the grind size varies a little bit from one to the next. I found I could be anywhere from like 3 revolutions to 4 revolutions from 0, depending on the coffee and what recipe I was using. And when I did that, you know, I was getting very clear, light body, some tying together of the flavor, but a lot of separation. And I can totally see why people would compare it to a ZP6 or a Pietro when you're brewing this way. Now, as good as as the cups were though, when I actually measured it with a refractometer, I found that sometimes, depending on how I was brewing, I could actually be flirting with under extraction. I mean, the cups tasted great. They didn't taste under extracted. It was a lot of flavor clarity. Generally, people seem to have success with tighter ratios in the pour over burr. And anytime I was finding that I was kind of edging a little bit lower on the extraction than I wanted, you know, there's lots of things that you can do to kind of push back against that. More agitation, open up your ratio a little bit, long bloom, that kind of thing. I had one person reach out to me and say, you know, I do a couple high agitation pours and then finish it off with a very low agitation pour. That works great too. But regardless of what I did, it seemed to come out very well and very clear. Now what happens is some people who actually don't want that style of cup read online that the best way to use the Kinu Pour Over Burr is to grind super coarse. And they end up with this very light bodied cup and they're like, it's missing something. Like, I wish it was, a little bigger, you know, or whatever. And if that's you and you want more this style of cup, more intense, a little bit more blend and a little bit heavier body, I'm gonna say go finer, you know, and I could be anywhere from like 2 to 3 revolutions. So roughly a full revolution finer to get that style of cup. I found low ratios were great for that style of cup, lower agitation. One other thing that I'll say as well, longer total brew times in addition to the shorter ratio is something that people very often find favorable when they're trying to find their perfect cup with the Kinu. So just another like little quirk there. And as far as it comes to this specific cup, how did I brew it? Well, I came in probably somewhere right about here. I went a little bit more to the intense side, a little bit more to the blend side to kind of mix up that very complex processing that is in this coffee. And for me, the result is really good. I'm still getting enough clarity, but it is bringing a little more like oomph to the table too. It's just getting even better as it cools. Now, I do have to say, in either case, this is something that throws a lot of people off. This grinder does create fines. So that means you're gonna maybe see some mud in your bed, kind of on the top of your coffee. It's not gonna give you that crisp, clean look that you might get from other grinders. Use your tongue, don't let that throw you off, and experiment on each side of the range, coarse and fine. If you have a refractometer, that can really help you guide to make sure you're getting the right extraction. If you're not, then tweak some of those things to try and get it in line with what you're looking for. Now, as far as espresso goes, the pour over burr takes a little bit longer overall to grind actually than the stock burr. I found it gave a little bit lighter body on espresso, a little bit more separation. Just because it takes so much longer to grind, I was finding, over 2 minutes to grind a shot of espresso for the way that I like to pull. I would probably actually lean to the stock burr for espresso, but it does work very well. And if you're into the profile and hand grinding for espresso isn't a big deal to you, you're gonna love it. I did find that no matter how I tried to adjust the recipe or the grind size or whatever, I could get drastically different cups, but it was really hard to get it into a zone where it felt like astringent, bitter, unflattering. It just seemed like nice cups right across the board. So very unusual. Most grinders would not have that, and it just is a little bit of a quirk of the way the pour over burr works. Now, as far as cons and considerations, always something I try to highlight when I'm reviewing something, and this is no exception. Number one, it's a premium grinder, and not only does it come at that price point, but with the pour over burr, depending on what you do, that can be an add-on. So that is about $50. And also, it doesn't feed back in the same way as other grinders, which can be a strength. It makes it a lot more flexible to kind of craft your perfect cup. But if you're just getting into this, it can also make the dial-in process confusing, because a lot of the conventional wisdom that might apply to other grinders may not apply to this one. The grind time is definitely something to consider. I found for pour over could take anywhere from 45 seconds on this end of the spectrum up to 60, 70 seconds on this end of the spectrum. The magnetic catch cup, you know, I like this. It just kind of pops off, but some grinds can kind of collect in and around the seams and ledges in here. And also popcorning is an issue with this grinder. And what that means is, you know, as you're grinding, you'll have little beans kind of popping out of this chute and go skittering across the floor, and you got to go pick them up. You can get aftermarket little things to slip in here, but it's just kind of annoying. Now, on the other hand, the build quality overall is probably some of the highest that I've used when it comes to hand grinders. One other thing, just because of some of the principles they use to manufacture this, the grinders tend to be very well aligned, but the actual grind settings can vary slightly from user to user. So that can make translating grind approaches from person to person across the internet difficult to do, in addition to how strangely the pour over burr reacts in and of itself. Now, on the other hand, the quality and build of this thing is probably, across the whole Kinu line, some of the nicest built hand grinders that I've used. You know, they're at that premium price point, and when you're using them, you just feel like you're using a premium product. And if you get both burrs, they don't take 2 seconds to change, but they are pretty quick, and you only need to change the inner burr. So if you get 2 of them, you have access to a massive spectrum of cups. You know, you can have that super thick, but still with clarity and nuance espresso shots. You can go from that all the way to more somewhere like a C40 with this kind of unique presentation of the acidity, all the way up to a ZP6 style or closer to a Pietro style cup of pour over. The range and flexibility that they kind of just managed to happen on with the combination of burrs that they use in these things, I can't think of another grinder that does that, and it's pretty cool. Now, if you aren't subscribed yet to my channel, you love geeking out on this stuff, you watch my videos regularly, you find them helpful, hit that subscribe button, because I'm always digging up new things to review and fun coffee stuff to share with you. And I want to hear your thoughts on this. If you're a pour over burr owner, how do you like brewing with it? If my kind of guide there was helpful to you figuring out your perfect cup with it, let me know in the comments. I hope your next cup of coffee is as good as this one is, and we'll see you next time.